Grisly trophies, evil cowboys, and questionable mascots. All that and more on today's bonus episode of Our Fake History. Hit the theme! Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and normally this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. But on these bonus shows, I like to take questions from my amazing community of listeners, and I do my best to answer them. Now, anyone at all can send me a question by sending me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com, but I always prioritize those questions that have come to me through the Patreon community. I know I say this all the time, but the patrons truly are the lifeblood of this show. The only reason there is an Our Fake History is because this amazing community of listeners supports the show. So shout out once again to my patrons. If you are a patron, you get access to these exclusive chats that I have set up through the Patreon page. So if you want to participate in those chats, go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory, find a level of support that works for you, and get on in there and start chatting with the patrons. As many of you know, we have just completed a series on Buffalo Bill Cody and his Wild West shows. Now, to be honest with you, this series genuinely surprised me. I came in knowing that Buffalo Bill was a bit of a myth maker and that his Wild West show propagated a number of historical myths about the American West. But his life story blew my mind. Here's why. He presented himself as a certain type of American archetype, the bold frontiersman who was bringing civilization to the West and then by extension, brought the Wild West back towards civilization. I get that, but what was really tripping me out is that, in actual fact, he was a very different type of American archetype. He was a hustler, an entrepreneur, and a man who would do absolutely anything to be famous. The fact that he lived his life in a way that would make for better showbiz content, to me seemed incredibly ahead of its time. And it's an aspect of Buffalo Bill I don't think is commented on enough. His whole shtick presaged the era of the reality star and the social media influencer that we are living in today. And that blew my mind. I really couldn't get over that. Buffalo Bill very much lived a get rich or die trying kind of a life. And if that's not an American archetype, I don't know what is. The irony, of course, is that in his quest to become rich and famous, he ended up presenting a cartoon version of the American West that many took as real history, and went on to influence images of the American West for decades. We're arguably still living in the shadow of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. So all of this is to say, I always knew that this topic was going to be interesting, but I found myself amazed by just how deep the themes ran in this particular series. I'm really glad that a lot of you folks seem to enjoy it as well. So, let's dive into some of your questions. Our very first question comes to us from Razi on Patreon. Razi writes, "Hey Seb, thanks for these great episodes. Are there any Wild West tropes we know from cinema and pop culture that can be safely attributed to Buffalo Bill's shows? Or were they all pre-existing tropes from dime novels and stage plays that he then brought to new levels of popularity? Thanks so much for that, Razi. This is a really good question. Honestly, you folks always have a way of getting at the heart of whatever I've chosen to title my episodes. I called this series Who Invented the Wild West, which of course suggests that the focus of the series, Buffalo Bill Cody, did some inventing. This naturally raises the question, what exactly did he invent? Well, Razi, I think you sensed what my answer was going to be, and you actually sort of included it in your question. You're right that many of the Wild West tropes that appeared in Buffalo Bill's show had their roots in dime novels and stage plays. Bill also borrowed from the popular proto-cinema experiences known as panoramas, where gigantic landscape paintings depicting the American West or other beautiful locales would be scrolled in front of audiences. His show also brought in elements from the ethnographic displays of indigenous people at various world fairs and other events. And to be fair, Buffalo Bill was also drawing from real life. But Bill's biggest innovation was bringing all of these elements together into one cohesive extravaganza, and then labeling the whole thing the Wild West. So you could say that the Wild West as a label is perhaps Buffalo Bill's biggest innovation. However, I think we can also give Bill some credit for reimagining the cowboy as a heroic figure. Up until the 1880s, the term cowboy had overwhelmingly negative connotations. The term cowboy was often used synonymously with the term cattle rustler. The reliable ranch hands who worked the cattle drives were more commonly known as cowhands, or simply cattlemen. We have lots of evidence that before the 1880s, cowhands did not like being called cowboys because cowboys were the criminal variant of the cattleman type. Western history buffs might also know that the group of outlaws involved in the shootout at the OK Corral with Wyatt Earp and his brothers were known as the Cochise County Cowboys. Right up until the early 1880s, there's evidence that the term cowboy was used as an insult. In 1888, the historian of the American Southwest, William Henry Bishop, explained that, quote, "The term cowboy, once applied to all those in the cattle business indiscriminately, while still including some honest persons, has been narrowed down to be chiefly a term of reproach for a class of stealers of cattle over the Mexican frontier and elsewhere, who are a terror in their day and generation." End quote. In other words, in the popular imagination, cowboys were villains. But when the Wild West show got started in 1883, Buffalo Bill started calling all his heroic cowhands cowboys. You might say that Buffalo Bill was reclaiming the term. As we spoke about in the last episode, the climax of many of Buffalo Bill's historical reenactments involved him riding in with a posse of around a dozen cowboys to save the day. Now, there are lots of examples of frontier heroes from plays and dime store novels that predate the Wild West shows. But these guys were usually hunters, scouts, or some other variety of frontiersmen. But as far as I can tell, the Wild West show was the first time that the cowboy was elevated to the position of the premier frontier hero. Now, I could be wrong about this. There might be a play or a novel with a cowboy hero that predates the Wild West show of 1883, but I did not come across it in my research. If you know of an example, please let me know. But as far as I can tell, Buffalo Bill, I think, invented the idea of the heroic cowboy. By the same token, I think we can also give Buffalo Bill both the credit, or perhaps the blame, for creating the perception that the war for the West was waged between quote-unquote cowboys and Indians. Bill did not invent the idea of a clash between white settlers and the native people of the plain. I mean, that's just a real thing that happened. But he did give the impression that most of the fighting was specifically happening between these roguish cowhands and feathered warriors on horseback. Remember, in real life, groups like the Lakota, the Pawnee, and the Cheyenne were primarily fighting the United States Army, not cattle-driving ranch hands or their less reputable cattle-rustling cousins. So, by setting cowboys up as the natural enemies of indigenous warriors, Buffalo Bill may have invented what we think of as cowboys and Indians. There may not have been a Cowboys and Indians children's game had it not been for Buffalo Bill. Now, to be clear, this is just a hunch that I have. None of the experts that I read were ready to make such a definitive declaration as Buffalo Bill invented cowboys and Indians. But, I don't know, he certainly popularized the idea. At the very least, Buffalo Bill helped the term cowboy take on positive connotations and popularized the idea that these cattle drivers were regularly forming posses and fighting various native tribes. Thanks again for that awesome question, Razi. I hope that brings a little more clarity to the issue. Our next question comes from EJ on Patreon. EJ writes, "Great episodes. You made a couple of comparisons to P.T. Barnum, which makes me wonder, did Buffalo Bill and Barnum ever cross paths? Can we see any evidence that they may have influenced each other?" Now, EJ was not the only person thinking along these lines. Dagwood Frightenstein asked this question that is very closely related. Dagwood asks, is it true that Bailey, Barnum's partner in the circus, bought a 50% stake in Cody's Wild West show as his show grew in popularity and size? I love that you folks were already seeing the connective tissue between these two 19th century showmen. Now, I certainly did compare Bill Cody to P.T. Barnum a number of times in this series. This was because I think Buffalo Bill had much more in common with America's premier showman and humbug artist than he did, say, Billy the Kid, Daniel Boone, or Davy Crockett. The more I learned about Buffalo Bill, the more it was clear that he was first and foremost an actor, a storyteller, and a carnival barker, more than he was a proper frontiersman. P.T. Barnum and Buffalo Bill were contemporaries, and they clearly knew of one another. We know that Bill Cody was inspired by the way that P.T. Barnum approached the promotion of his circuses. Barnum had wanted to elevate the reputation of the circus and attract the quote-unquote respectable middle-class audience that Bill Cody also coveted. But as far as we know, the two men never actually met. But as Dagwood pointed out, the two men did share a business partner. This was James Bailey. He was the Bailey in the famous Barnum and Bailey circus. In 1895, 4 years after the death of P.T. Barnum, Bailey was brought on as a partner in the Wild West show. Now, originally, he only had a small stake in the business. Bailey provided his circus touring infrastructure. We're talking circus trains, tents, yada, 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 in exchange for a cut of the show's profits. But as I mentioned near the end of the second episode, Buffalo Bill was horrible with money. Despite the continued success of the Wild West, Bill kept on finding himself in financial peril. As such, he kept on having to borrow more and more money from James Bailey. By the time of Bailey's death in 1906, the circus promoter technically owned a 2/3 share in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. This was largely thanks to Bill's financial mismanagement. So, while P.T. Barnum and Buffalo Bill never actually met, they were deeply connected. And in my opinion, I think they were cut from the same cloth. The next question also comes through Patreon. This one is from a patron named Yasser. Yasser writes, I loved these episodes. Really, really interesting. But Buffalo Bill, to me, didn't come across as a charlatan. He came across like a modern history reenactor. Someone who isn't telling history per se, but capturing a gestalt. I've done enough reenactment to feel like we do the same. Sometimes we don't reenact exact battles, but show how it could have gone. In that process, you change things a bit to make it a good show. Sure, he is more dramatic about it, but I don't see it as an awful thing. Maybe I have a soft spot for reenactor types. Just my 2 cents. Love the show. You've been in my ear through COVID and a lot of stuff. Keep up the wonderful work. Thanks so much for that, Yasser. Hey, I know a lot of you out there found this show during COVID, and wow, we have been through a lot together. So if you've been with me since that time, just think how far we've come. Holy moly. Now, Yasser's comment gave me some real food for thought. Dude, I hear what you're saying, and I will say that I too have a soft spot for historical reenactors. And for the record, I have absolutely no beef with historical reenactments. When historical reenactments are done well, they can be incredibly engaging and educational. I'll never forget, as a kid, when we were learning about the War of 1812, we met up with a teacher. He was actually from another school. We had to walk to another school to meet this teacher who was a War of 1812 reenactor. And honestly, it was one of the greatest history classes I remember having as a young kid. He got the kids dressed up. He ran us through 19th century British military drills. It clearly left an impression on me. I'm still talking about it 30 years later. I also understand that all reenactments are necessarily going to have to take some liberties. You're putting on a play. I get it. If I was especially critical of Buffalo Bill, it was because so many of his so-called historical reenactments were totally fictional. The siege of the settler cabin and the robbery of the Deadwood stagecoach were not at all reflections of real events, but they were passed off as legitimate history. Now, I think he would argue that he was capturing a gestalt, but the thing he was capturing was also a myth. It was these fictional scenes that really played into the negative prejudices about indigenous people. Interestingly, Bill's reenactment of the Battle of Little Bighorn, the one real historical event that he actually depicted, was far more reasonable in its depiction of indigenous people and U.S. Army soldiers. So you see what I'm saying here? Buffalo Bill had to invent fake historical moments so that indigenous people were more obviously understood as villains. That is what I was really trying to criticize. And when I found that interview where Bill said that, quote, in 9 times out of 10 where there is trouble between white men and Indians, it will be found that the white man is responsible. End quote. I found that to be deeply ironic because for the most part, the Wild West show did not communicate that message. The indigenous people in the show were almost always the instigators of the violence in his fictional historical reenactments. One of the reasons people believed that indigenous people were the cause of all the problems in the American West was because shows like Buffalo Bill's Wild West were explicitly telling them that. Buffalo Bill clearly understood what narrative his audience expected, and that is what he gave them, even when it contradicted both the historical record and his own lived experience. But this criticism was not meant to kibosh all historical reenactments. If you are a reenactor, I love you. Keep doing what you're doing. Just, do it responsibly, right? Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Homes.com. If you've ever been in the market for a new home, you know home shopping can be a lot. There's so much you don't know and so much you need to know. What are the neighborhoods like? What are the schools like? Who's the agent who knows the listing or neighborhood best? And why can't all this information just be in one place? Well, now it is on Homes.com. They've got everything you need to know about the listing itself, but even better, they've got comprehensive neighborhood guides and detailed reports about local schools. And their agent directory helps you see the agent's current listings and sales history. Homes.com collaboration tools make it easier than ever to share all this information with your family. It's a whole cul-de-sac of home shopping information all at your fingertips. Homes.com. We've done your homework. Hey, I don't know about you folks, but over the holidays, I don't really prioritize my health. I'm eating lots of rich food. I'm dabbling in the holiday cookies. I like an eggnog or two. But after I ring in the new year, I'm usually left feeling like I need to get my health back on track. And that's where AG1 comes in. For those that don't know, AG1 is the daily health drink that combines multivitamins, pre- and probiotics, and antioxidants into one simple green scoop. It's one of the easiest things you can do to support your body every day. During the holidays, it can be hard to maintain a balanced diet and give your body the nutrients it needs. Well, the newest version of AG1, AG1 Next Gen, contains more vitamins and minerals than ever before, and it's clinically shown to fill common nutrient gaps. Just in time for the new year, AG1 has their best offer ever. If you head to drinkag1.com/fake, you'll get a welcome kit, a morning person hat, a bottle of vitamin D3 and K2, an AG1 flavor sampler, and you'll get to try their new sleep supplement, AGZ, for free, which has been a game changer for many nightly routines. That's ag1.com/fake for $126 in free gifts for new subscribers. Our next question comes to us through the email inbox from a listener named Alex. Alex writes, "Hey Sebastian, long-time listener, first-time emailer. You spent some time emphasizing the nastiness of Buffalo Bill mutilating the body of Yellowhair. However, as someone who grew up with a dad who loved watching John Wayne movies, Dances with Wolves, and The Last of the Mohicans, it felt like scalping was a very common experience in the Wild West. It felt like it was just the way things happened. So my question is, how common was the act of scalping in the Wild West? Would Buffalo Bill's contemporaries have thought that it was gruesome of him to do that?" Thanks so much for that question, Alex. Man, you really put your finger on one of the most controversial topics that I brushed up against in that episode. The practice of scalping has been the source of some fairly intense historical debate. Now, you very clearly picked up on my personal distaste for Bill's desecration of Yellowhair's body. And apologies if I laid it on a little thick. But I found myself both disgusted and darkly fascinated by that moment, if I can say that. What really got me was how gratuitous it was for Bill to scalp that man at that particular moment. I was struck by how it seemed entirely motivated by Bill's show business career. Now, Bill would later claim that he was driven by a feeling of righteous vengeance for the death of Custer, but we know that that was just a story. Bill didn't know George Custer personally, and by all accounts, George Custer didn't really even think much of Buffalo Bill. Bill clearly did it because he knew it would make for a good play. I mean, he dressed in a stage costume that day. It just continues to blow my mind. Bill wasn't motivated by vengeance or some twisted sense of justice. He wasn't even motivated by hatred. He was motivated by fame. And I know I said this in the series, but I kept on thinking about the dark ends that people go to pursue fame in our own moment. So many creators feel pressure to do bizarre, immoral, and regrettable things simply to feed the content beast of their Instagram feed, YouTube channel, or, podcast. Buffalo Bill literally killed a man and took his scalp for the sake of his theater career. He did it for the content. But I still haven't answered your question. How common was scalping in the 19th century, and how did people feel about it? The answer is that scalping was quite common. But if there's a misconception about scalping, it's that it was an exclusively indigenous practice. In the past, it was often assumed that scalping was predominantly practiced by North American indigenous groups. And the practice was often pointed to as evidence of indigenous quote-unquote barbarity. Now, it is true that removing a piece of a fallen enemy's scalp and hair was something that was done by various indigenous groups across North America, even before the period of contact with Europeans. We have human remains, archaeological finds, and indigenous art that all attest to that fact. However, during the early colonial period and the era of early contact between North American indigenous folks and newly arrived Europeans, scalping seems to have become more common. This was because many settlers embraced the practice of taking trophies from indigenous people that they killed over the course of various conflicts. In fact, settlers were often encouraged by their colonial governments to scalp indigenous people. We know that the colonial government of New France, and what is today Canada and parts of the United States, offered bounties for the scalps of indigenous groups that they happened to be at war with. Similar scalp bounties were offered in the New England colonies during the Susquehannock War, the King Philip's War, and during the 7 Years' War, or what the Americans call the French and Indian War. All of this is to say that by the 19th century, there was a 300-year history of scalpings being incentivized by colonial governments. Indigenous people certainly practiced scalping, but by the mid-1800s, you could argue that scalping was just as much a Euro-American practice. So, let's bring it up to Buffalo Bill's time and place. During the Black Hills War in the late 1870s, you can find examples of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors scalping dead American soldiers. You can also find many examples of American soldiers and scouts like Bill Cody scalping indigenous people. Both sides were doing this, but Buffalo Bill helped popularize the idea that taking a scalp was an acceptable way to avenge the death of George Armstrong Custer. You might remember that he promoted his exploit as the first scalp for Custer. That very name implies that this is just the first of many scalps that would be taken to avenge the death of the famous American military commander. The publicity that surrounded Bill's exploit arguably led to more scalpings done by American servicemen and other people working for the American government at the time. So, how did people feel about Bill doing this to this Cheyenne warrior? Well, it seems like there were mixed feelings. At first, Bill's audiences seemed to respond positively to the story of the first scalp for Custer. But even in 1877, when he first started to tour his play, The Red Right Hand, there were some theaters in the eastern United States that wouldn't allow Bill to display the real scalp in the theater lobbies. This was because displaying real human remains was considered to be in bad taste. 19th century theater audiences seemed to like the simulated violence of Buffalo Bill's plays, but they were a little less keen on inspecting his grisly trophies. As times and tastes changed, Bill became far more careful about when and where he displayed Yellowhair's scalp. As his relationships with real indigenous people who were working in his Wild West show deepened, Bill seems to have gained more empathy for the indigenous experience. Later in life, he even expressed some regret that he had mutilated Yellowhair's body that day. So, to answer your question, during the Black Hills War of the 1870s, scalping was fairly common. But it was just as common among Euro-Americans fighting for the U.S. Army as it was for indigenous groups like the Lakota or the Cheyenne. Based on my reading, it seems like it was understood as a gruesome but expected part of warfare on the frontier. But I still think that Bill's exploit was kind of unique because of its strange motivations. Guys, he was wearing a stage costume when he did it. I'll just never get over that. Okay, our final comment today comes to us from a listener from Belgium named Frederick. Frederick writes, "Hi, Sebastian. I don't have a question, but a fun fact about Buffalo Bill. My favorite soccer team, KAA Ghent of Belgium, is nicknamed the Buffaloes and has a Native American logo as a mascot. All of this goes back to a visit of Buffalo Bill and his circus in the period of the club's founding. Here's a quick overview. AA Ghent is called the Buffaloes because of the popularity of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show when it visited Ghent in the late 19th/early 20th century. The enthusiastic crowd chants of "Buffalo, Buffalo" were adopted by students and eventually the sports club, leading to the nickname and the iconic Native American logo, symbolizing a warrior spirit and Wild West excitement. Good luck with the show and happy holidays. Frederick from Belgium." Thanks so much for sharing that, Frederick. Oh man, that one really blew my mind. As if the soccer team from Ghent is the Buffaloes. They're not the altarpieces. I guess altarpieces does not strike fear into the hearts of your rivals on the pitch. But the Ghent Buffaloes, that is really something. If you dare, you can go check out the mascot for the Ghent Buffaloes, a Belgian fellow in a full feathered headdress. I'm not sure if that particular mascot's going to be long for this world, but man, that's pretty wild. In the last episode, I spent some time talking about the Wild West mania that swept through London when Buffalo Bill first took his show to the UK. But I kind of yada-yada'd over the many European tours that the show did. Clearly, Europeans went crazy for Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and the legacy lives on in Ghent, Belgium. So, very cool. Thanks again, Frederick. I love hearing from listeners who are from every corner of the world. I love that we've got listeners in Belgium. Thanks for reaching out. That was really fun. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore an all-new historical myth. Before we go this week, I just want to remind everyone that we are going to Greece. Now is the time to book if you want to come with me on the trip of a lifetime through Athens, Crete, Santorini, and all sorts of other beautiful locations in Greece. My gosh, it's going to be an incredible time. We're going to museums. We are going to archaeological sites. We are going to be sailing the Aegean. We are going to be staying in incredible hotels. It's going to rule. I can't wait. We still have some spots available if you would like to join us, and you really should. So if you want to come, then please go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links for the trip, or go to johnshorestravel.com and look at the upcoming trips for 2026. If you book, please use promo code OFH so they know that I sent you. It's going to be an amazing time. If you would like to become a patron of this show, go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and find a level of support that works for you. We are going to have an all-new exclusive patrons-only episode on the 7 wonders of the ancient world coming in the next few months. So if you want to get in on that awesome new extra episode and all the other extras that are available for you there, then please go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. If you ever want to send me a message, I love hearing from you. So please send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Hit me up on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. Find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. Find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. Find me on Blue Sky at ourfakehistory. I am on every social media platform. I'm also on YouTube. Look for the YouTube channel where I'm putting out all our fun little YouTube shorts. As always, the theme music for our show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
Stream blockbuster hits like 21 Jump Street, Ted, The Expendables, and so much more on Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.